Talking today with Brett Meanor, the eldest son of Earl and Jane Meanor. Brett, why did you decide to tell the story of your family, the family of Earl and Jane Meanor?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to interview, and I really appreciate it. The reason is actually pretty simple. If you're active in a church or just interested in people, you'll see different stories about families and what they deal with, or some major event that took place, and follow this family or follow this person. And I think in the case of our family, our situation was so unique. It is so oftentimes I don't think anybody's heard of a story like this, and I think it's very important to tell it.
Where did your dad and mom meet?
Mom and dad met at the Knowles restaurant. That's Knolls restaurant in Niskayuna, New York. Now, to give you a little background to that, my dad worked at a place called the Knowles Atomic Power Lab, and he came into the restaurant to buy food, and mom was a waitress. And as mom said, the moment she saw dad, she knew that it was he. She just knew because he was so handsome and polite and charming. But one thing I should point out to you is they were from that part of the country. Jane Meanor, my mother, was born in Lake Placid, New York, on March 22nd, 1933, and Dad was born in Hudson Falls, New York, in on December 17th, 1931. For both mom and dad, they had parents. My dad's parents were William Harper Meanor and Francetta Meanor. Unfortunately, I didn't really know my grandparents on dad's side because grandma died when dad was 14, and grandpa was I was probably 5 when he passed away. So the only grandparents I got to know was mom's parents, and that was Mary and Martin Cummings. And in their situation, Grandpa Cummings worked for the railroad in the Albany area, and there was an accident, and as a result, he was paid a lump sum. And with that lump sum, he built the Knowles restaurant and the house next door. And so as a result, mom and dad met, and two boys, Brett and Brad, were born.
What are some of the things that stand out about your dad's personality?
Well, I think what people would say about dad was, even though he was a quiet fella, he had his moments of being humorous in a kind of a sarcastic way. I'm thinking of, for example, of the time when he'd come into the restaurant, and my grandmother, again, we're talking about Mary Cummings, would come up to my mom and dad and say, talk to dad. My dad's name was Earl, as I said, and say, Earl, I just can't believe this. The day has been going very long. It's been very difficult. And after hearing grandma go on for a few minutes, dad would go up and walk away and say, excuse himself, and walk up to what we call a jukebox. For those of you who don't know what a jukebox is, that was a box that literally had music selections. You put a quarter in or a nickel in or whatever, and it would play a song. Well, dad walked over to the jukebox, put a quarter in, and he picked the song that was done by Pat Boone, even though Pat Domino also did it. Ain't that a shame? So he pushed the button, and as Mary, my grandmother, was complaining, it would go off, ain't that a shame? And he'd come back, and she said, oh, Earl, you just don't understand. She'd walk away, irritated. But that was dad's sense of humor. He just did that often.
What are the 5 things that happened to your dad that changed your family forever?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because they really did change everything. I'm thinking, first of all, the blacklist. Now, the blacklist, basically what the blacklist was, no, I forgot to mention that Knowles Atomic Power Labs where dad worked, but they were affiliated with what's called General Electric Corporation. And in those days, General Electric owned the area. Probably not so much anymore, but back in those days, it dominated. In fact, it built a lot of stuff in Schenectady in that area. Well, Dad, while being a very quiet man, if anybody asked his opinion on things, he would say his opinion. And that's what got him into trouble. For example, during the 1960s, there were some issues about demonstrations against the Vietnam War. And one of those issues had to do with the burning of American flags. And people were just absolutely apoplectic that this, how could they do that? And so my dad was asked about it. He says, why do you all complain? He says, every day, it's called desecration of the American flag. He said, you all complain about that. But every day, the post office stamps the American flag on the postcards and on the letters. Every day, thousands. Well, that didn't go over too well with them. And the other thing was, my dad was not a big fan of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the president of the United States and at one time governor of New York. And those in New York State, they considered him a hero. And for Dad, he had some words in between F, D, and R that I cannot repeat for the public. And he just didn't like the man. There was also something else, and that was Dad was very smart, probably an IQ around 200. He maybe exaggerate, but he was brilliant. And he did not agree with Einstein's theory of relativity. That's the E equals MC squared. He said it was he used to say it's 180 degrees out of phase. Well, here he is working for a nuclear facility, atomic power. I mean, what do you think their main theory is? Obviously, Einstein. But remember, he was asked, and so he told people. Well, that added up. And in fact, I'm going to fast forward a few years later. I'll come back to the 5 points in a second. But throughout my growing up, my dad told me about a guy named Freddie Marcelli. Freddie Marcelli was his best friend at the Knolls, he said. And so one day I got the courage up to call Freddie Marcelli. Yeah, I did one of those out of the blue phone calls. I called him up after about 10 minutes, explaining my name, where I came from. He finally believed I was Earl Meanor's son. And after talking to Freddie, we talked a little bit about where he was at and all that stuff. And I said, Freddie, there's a couple things that are going on with my dad. One is Dad says he's being followed. That's one thing. In other words, he would turn on the TV and he'd say, be quiet what you say, because right now they're listening in. He would know that people were listening in. Or he would go down the street somewhere and he said, I think someone was following me. I said, I don't understand that. He said, well, your dad was being followed, Brett, because we were all being followed. He said it was the Cold War, spies everywhere. So everybody on our team is being followed. So please tell your dad it wasn't him. It was everybody on the team. I said, well, then what was my dad like to work with? What kind of person? Brett, he was the nicest man I ever knew. I said, really? Yes, very easy to work with and everything. If that's the case, I said, then why did you get blacklisted? And he said, very simple. There was a handful of guys that just didn't like him. And he said that, well, how come he didn't like him? Because he didn't go out and schmooze with the boys. He didn't go out and drink. He didn't go out of town with everybody. He didn't brown up. He just didn't do that. He went home to his family. So that was a big part of what happened. So you get the blacklist. The second thing that happened was something to do with what he was working on. My dad's work was quality control engineer. He was a quality control, non-destructive tester. He worked with radiology, photography, and all kinds of different mechanisms. And one thing he was working on was a device that would take pictures quickly. Now, let me give you a little context to that. Back 60 or 70 years ago, if you bought a camera, you'd run to the store and buy film. And you stick the film in, and you go walk around, you take your pictures, smile everybody, you take pictures here and there, and you go through the film, and then you take the film out after you're done and go to the drugstore, and they would send it out to be developed, and you get a call a few days later, your film's back. Well, Dad had a better idea. He said, I got an idea. Why don't we make it so you can take the picture and make it produce right there? He came up with that. Well, since he had an office at the plant, he had all these designs in a booklet. Well, one day He's turning on the TV. It was around 1965, and he sees this guy saying, "Ladies and gentlemen," now I could have the name on it, either Polaroid or Kodak. I get it mixed up, but ladies and gentlemen, the Kodak Instamatic camera. And the salesman takes the picture, and the picture comes out, and I'm like, "Oh my!" And Dad looked at it and said, "How did that happen?" He goes back to the office and discovers that that booklet that had the paper in it, where his design was, that paper was ripped out. That was stolen. That's the second thing. The third thing happened when we had medical bills. Brad with his disability, and me with my eye and other things, he had to pay for them. And of course, working in a nuclear atomic facility just didn't do it. So he went to the races, horse races. And he enjoyed it because, believe it or not, as a brilliant guy, it stimulated his intellect. He enjoyed the challenge. And so he got good at it. So good that he actually hit several trifectas and perfectas, 75,001, 50,000, 30,000, and those perfectas paid the medical bills. It was absolutely amazing. Well, one day he gets a call from New York State. Said, "Mr. Meanor, come in to see us." And they sat him down and says, "Hey, we noticed you won some money." And he said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you owe us." He says, "I don't owe you anything." He said, "Well, you've obviously made money, but I've also spent a lot of money." And he presented the documents he had, like tickets and like bank accounts and stuff. "Oh, no, 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 no. You can't. That's not good enough. We need a booklet that shows every day you were out there, what you wrote down, what you bet, everything in detail as to what you spent and took in and paid out. That's the only way we can accept your explanation." Well, Dad said, "Well, you know what you can do with that explanation." And he walked out. They put a $100,000 judgment against him, and that was the last time he saw them. He never paid it. Then there was something else that took place. Dad was a bit of a smart aleck, as I said. He didn't like his job because he was bored with it. Believe it or not, he was bored with atomic power. Bored with atomic power. Think of that. Bored with it. Anyway, what he did was he was at a place called West Milton. And at West Milton, um, they would do testing. There were towers. This is you might call the Area 51 of New York. No one knows about it, but everybody knows it. It's a known secret. You go there. He went there once every couple weeks and go up the tower and do testing and come down. But one day he got bored and decided that he was gonna, instead of climbing down a ladder properly, he decided to skip a few rings down. Well, that was a bad mistake because he lost his balance. And what he had to do was literally reach out with a ladder ring, pull it, and he saved his own life, yes, but in the process, he popped a disc. And for the rest of his life, he had a slip disc. And that would affect him later on with work situations where he would sometimes be out for several days because that thing would just pop out in different times and different situations later on where he had to deal with that. That was the fourth thing. And the fifth thing is probably more a family thing, even though everything's related to the family. We drove out to California a couple of times, and Dad decided that schools weren't good enough, and Mom got homesick, so we came back. Mom and Dad thought it was a mistake, but anyway, we did it. One Christmas, it was a Christmas 66 or 67, whatever that. And Mom said, "We got to go to the store because we wanted to get a birthday Christmas present for one of my teachers." And so we went to the store, and when Dad said, "Don't go," because it was snowing or going to snow or something. He said, "I just don't," he had what he called a premonition. "I don't think you better go. I think it's not the right time to go. Don't go." Mom said, "Oh, we'll be all right. We'll be okay." We went, and started snowing. It was snowing hard. And we came back over the bridge, and our car hit a spot. We went for a spin, hit the guardrail. I landed in the well. Mom landed over me. We were okay. But that car was not much worth anything after that. And that was kind of the beginning of the downward spiral.
What is the relevance of the Hotel Foster and the Hotel Van Curler?
Well, I'm going to talk about that in part two.